The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
I've been trying to wrestle with the line between poetry and prayer, and ultimately realizing there doesn't have to be a line. Like it can totally blend. And I think it's beautiful when it blends. Because so often we almost water down our prayers to God, like assuming he doesn't want to hear it all. Even if we feel like we're bursting with thoughts and feelings, I think me personally, I can restrain them with God a bit. And so I think poetry gives me permission just to do it all, say it all.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Audrey, Elledge, and Elizabeth Moore started writing liturgies and prayers for their local church in New York City as a way of helping their friends and co-congregants deal with the isolation and the fear of the COVID-19 lockdowns in that city. Those liturgies grew to become a new book, Liturgies of Hope, 60 prayers for the highs, the lows, and everything in between. In this episode, Audrey and Elizabeth and I talk about the connections between poetry and prayer and liturgy, and the connections between creativity and friendship and community. Audrey Elledge and Elizabeth Moore, I'm so happy to have you all on the Habit Podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, thanks for having us.
And I'm really glad about your new book, Liturgies for Hope. Yes. 60 prayers. You say 60 prayers for the highs, lows, and everything in between.
That's right.
So talk to me about how this book came to be. It's kind of an interesting story.
It is an interesting story.
Yeah.
I feel like Audrey just actually discovered our original text conversation.
Oh, really?
Where she threw out the idea to me. I think it was March 18th, 2020. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, you should tell. Ago. Yeah, over 2.5 years ago. 2.5 years ago.
Yes. We should preface the backstory with this. It was never meant to be a book.
Never.
So the fact that it's a book is just a continual delight and surprise and amusing thing to Elizabeth and me. So basically 2.5 years ago, the seed of an idea was birthed when the world was collapsing. And so New York City at the time, which was where we were living and where we currently live as well, became known as the epicenter, the global epicenter of the pandemic, which is the scariest label I think you could give a city that you live in.
Yeah, right.
So people were hoarding toilet paper, lockdowns were starting. People were buying up all the NyQuil in the stores, all the thermometers. I couldn't get a thermometer for the life of me. It was just really scary times, as it was for everyone, not just New Yorkers. And so I actually left to quarantine with my family, and Elizabeth stayed in New York. And during that time, I think out of a desperate need I had for connection with another writer and friend, I texted Elizabeth on the airplane, which was the scariest plane ride of my life in March 2020. Like, first time wearing a mask with a bunch of strangers in masks.
Wow.
And I texted her, and I was, out of this desperation I personally felt, I was like, I feel like I need words of hope to cling to. And obviously we have scripture, but like as writers, could we create something not similar to scripture, but something based off scripture to kind of ground us and to maybe like ground our church in New York? We both go to Church of the City, New York, and we're pretty involved. And so we were just seeing this like confusion and despair and weariness in the congregation and our friends that go to that church. So, so I texted Elizabeth and I said, what if we wrote like prayers, liturgies for different anxieties that we have and that we see other people have, and gave them to our church and had them do whatever they want with them. What do you think? And then Elizabeth was on board, which I hope she would be. Because I really didn't want to do it alone. I didn't want to write alone. I don't think anyone wanted to be alone during this time when we were asked to be alone. And so that was such a gift, even though we were in different cities, still being connected through this project that we did pretty fast. We wrote, was it 11 or 13 liturgies over the course of one weekend?
Wow.
Because we wanted to get them out there because the like urgency of the moment felt so real. We were like, we can't wait a second longer to get this out to people we love who we see are struggling like we are.
Yeah,
So,
this was March of 2020 that this started?
right at the crux of everything.
And then you released the first batch around Easter, right?
Yes.
You released
on
them
Easter Day.
to your congregation.
Yes. So some great friends of ours who are creators themselves at Church of the City, they really rallied with us and helped us build a website to house the liturgies. So major shout out to Chris Lowe, Jeff Walden, Kristen Smith, especially, who they basically just saw the, like, I think the hope in this project, which we haphazardly called Liturgies for Hope. And it ended up being the name of the eventual book, which is hilarious to us.
That is hilarious.
We never meant that to be the title, but
no, I like slapped it on the Google Doc and I was like, Liturgies for Hope. And then I was like, that's the book title.
Yeah, it is full circle. So they basically helped us build this amazing website that was filled with color and life and all these things we felt like we were missing. And we released it on Easter Sunday 2020, which was one of the wildest Easters I think in my life I've ever experienced. On this day when we're celebrating hope, but maybe we didn't really feel it that day. And so that was their release.
Yeah, I love that connection between both friendship and also the wider community that you were writing for people you knew.
Yeah.
And it was a time when our pastor, John Tyson, he was like, this is the time when we're all going to be binging really bad content because we're all stressed. We're all experiencing anxiety. We're all going to be like watching Tiger King or whatever. And so Audrey and I, and also Church of the City places a strong value in like using our, whatever our giftings are, however unique they may be, to serve God and to serve each other. And so Audrey and I feel a strong kinship to each other as writers and as artists. And so I love that it was Audrey's idea to serve the church through our creative giftings. And it was so fun.
Yeah. There is a necessary, I say necessary, it seems to me pretty necessary component of writing that involves being alone. You have to go in the cave and do the work. And yet, it's this odd thing that you have to be alone to do. You tend to have to be alone to do it, but you're hoping that you're not doing it. You're doing it as an act of defying loneliness.
Yeah.
And
you're not doing it to stay alone.
What's that?
You're not right. You have to write alone, but you're not doing it to stay alone. Like the end product is hopefully to connect with other people. And So I love the way that that story is sort of an exaggerated version of what's true of all writing and creative work.
Such an extreme example. Of that creativity for sure.
Yeah. And writing, I just love that you're writing for your people. And you know, and then as it turns out, there's a wider world that will benefit from that work. But it was,
and the solitude was beautiful too. I think I think this was in my text to Audrey. We just discovered these today. That initial text.
We have receipts.
That I remember I texted her and was like, these surprisingly, like those mornings in March 2020 were they started out kind of anxious, but they immediately pushed me into like the comfort of the Lord because I needed it so badly. So I texted Audrey and I was like, weirdly, the past few mornings have been so rich and like sweet time with God because I need him so intensely. And so like that's like what the liturgies were born out of, was like we need like intimacy with God so deeply. And this is how we experience, one of the ways we experience intimacy with God as writers is through writing. And so I think that, yeah, like you're saying, you have to be alone to write, and we did. But even that was like beautiful. Like that kind of made, well, obviously liturgies are prayer, but the process of writing these liturgies are so filled with prayer. We're just in the presence of God, like asking him, like, what do you want to say to us? What do you want us to say to you? Like, help.
So, I think that's why we're able to write them so quickly. Like all of them got done over the course of a weekend because we were just writing from a place of deep dependence on God. And it was essentially us praying like through our keyboards as we were writing our drafts. I think that's why they came so fast, was because we knew we weren't writing for like a publication, or we weren't writing something that was going to be graded, or like you know what I mean. It was prayer. It was meant for God, and I would say it was meant even more for God than it was for our church. Like it was like our way of communicating with him in that very confusing time.
Have y'all done any thinking about the connection between poetry and prayer?
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, from the looks of the liturgies, you know.
we thought about it a few times. It's interesting because I didn't start writing poetry till after I wrote these liturgies. Like these liturgies for me were like my first kind of foray into the poetic form. And now I write poems all the time. So I think that was really opened up my mind to see how writing poetry can be a form of prayer. Because I think that like poetry is our way of like not really finding answers, but a way of like kind of discovering our way through something. And poetry is honest, poetry is messy, but also poetry is like a way of putting form around something that can be messy. And I think that's how prayer should be. Like prayer should be honest, and it should be messy, and it should be like a tool to navigate through something difficult. So
totally. Yeah, I feel like what I've discovered recently is that poetry and prayer draw from the same well. So I think both are trying to articulate or put words around something that feels inexpressible, but it's like us humans doing our best to express what we're feeling or what we see or experiencing. And so I, of course, think of David in the Psalms, and his Psalms were Hebrew poetry. And so seeing the way he just like vacillated from like extreme praise to lament and back and forth, I think has given me permission in writing poetry to do the same, and to like look at past poets whose prayer and poetry like were really blended. Like the very first English class I took in college was a British literature class. And the first thing we read was John Donne's Holy Sonnet, where he says, "Batter my heart, three-person God." And I came alive. I was like, I didn't know poetry and literature could be like this. I just felt something so deeply. And I think since then, I've been trying to wrestle with like the line between poetry and prayer, and ultimately realizing there doesn't have to be a line. Like it can totally blend. And I think it's beautiful when it blends, because so often I think we, I don't know, we almost water down our prayers to God, like assuming he doesn't want to hear it all. Even if we feel like we're bursting with like thoughts and feelings. I think me personally, I could like restrain them with God a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think poetry gives me permission just to do it all, like say it all. God.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even more than prose, poetry seeks to, I mean, you've sort of already said this, take the ineffable and wrestle around with it until somehow you have something that you can hold on to. Always knowing that there's slippage there, right? that you can't really, the ineffable is ineffable.
Right.
And yet, and I think that's part of the reason you have such different poems about the same things.
Yeah.
Is because the words can't contain the ineffable.
And
but
we're
it
all
contains
wrestling.
one little corner of it.
Yeah. It's right. It's like each poet is kind of like giving their perspective into it, or like that moment in time where they were wrestling with a specific thing. Like, here's what came of it.
Yeah.
I also think poetry is like writing it and reading it is a way of listening. I think like in terms of like prayer, a way of listening for the Lord's voice, or like it's also a way of seeking beauty, finding beauty. And I think that that's kind of what prayer is as well. Like both poetry and prayer connect us to beauty. And I just think of that. I think it's Psalm 27 that says like, one thing I ask of the Lord, this is what I seek, that I may gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and like, or dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon his beauty. And I think like, when I read poetry, I'm like, I'm gazing upon beauty. And when I like am praying, I'm like, oh, like, yes, like I just want to like gaze upon your beauty. And I feel like that's like a cool like thing that we get to do as artists, is just like position ourselves close to God and like write it down, or however our creative expression is, like express it somehow.
In one of your liturgies, now I can't remember which one it is, or it may even be. By the way, I love the little introductions to each section. I think those are great too.
Our poetic interludes. We love them.
All right.
We added those at the very end of our
Did you?
writing.
Yeah.
It was this idea we had where we wanted to do poetic prose in addition to poetic prayers. I think just to stretch ourselves as writers. It was next we wanted to do. But so thank you.
Either in now I don't remember. I think it was probably in the introduction to the section on wonder. You talk about the idea, and this also I think is in some of the liturgies, is the idea that there are these beauties all around us that are easy to not pay attention to, and then as we pay attention to them, things happen, right?
Yes.
And as you say, gazing on the beauty of the Lord, also gazing on the beauty of the created order that the Lord made.
Yes.
Again, both prayer and poetry are a function of paying attention to those things and not letting them pass by.
Totally.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So, okay, we've touched on the connection between poetry and prayer. While we're at it, liturgy, creative work, right? There's a liturgical component to getting creative work done.
Yeah.
What kind of work liturgies did you all inhabit as you were right now? You've already said that you knocked out a dozen or so in one weekend, but then you also had to write 48 more.
Right.
How did that go, by the way? Those probably didn't write the next 48 over.
Those weren't done in a weekend.
Absolutely.
Took a little bit longer.
So,
it was interesting.
Yeah. Did you have rhythms of work that were informed by liturgical practices? That's a leading question, because by definition, a rhythm of work is a liturgical.
That's right.
Is a kind
so true. But it was cool, like discovering our own, like what we each, because I'm sure we did them differently, Audrey. So like, for me, my practice usually was to begin with the topic at hand. We knew what topics we were going to be writing liturgies on beforehand. And I would take the topic at hand and I would journal out a rough prayer from my own heart. Like, just what do I want to say? What am I feeling? What am I experiencing? If it was something that maybe I haven't experienced before, like what can I imagine this experience is like? And I would just write it down, for like actually pen to paper, journal out a prayer, and then go to scripture and look up like everything I could find. Like, what does God say about this? Who are other people in scripture that have experienced something akin to this? What happened to them? What did they pray? What did God say to them? All of that. And then would write a rough draft. And then now it feels like it's getting less into like spiritual liturgy and more into just like the creative practice of like discipline and doing it.
Yeah.
But it was like blending those two things of it was prayer and it was also discipline. And I think that is interesting because that's kind of what liturgy is. Like liturgy is a form of worship, or it's like a form to lead us into worship. So,
Yeah.
What did yours look like, Audrey?
Yeah. So this was our first book, like our first full length book that we've ever written. And so we were really figuring it out as we went. And like I said, I can't reiterate this enough. We did not intend for this to be a book. And so it came with the most delightful surprise. So yes, learning the liturgy of writing, I love how you phrase that, was so important. I just remembered I was going on a lot of walks. I feel like I needed to get my body moving in order to like get my spirit and mind moving as well.
Yeah.
By the time we were writing the book, lockdowns had lifted, we were allowed outside. And so there was a little more freedom in the world, but I wanted to like really just work out ideas with God first before opening the blank page and just going to town. And so I went on a lot of walks. I spent a lot of time on my little teeny tiny patio, like sitting in the sun in the morning with a cup of coffee, just like thinking about whatever topic I knew I wanted to write that day, and just kind of like asking God, what do you want to say about this? And even asking God to remind me of who the readers might be. So I've heard an author say before that when he writes, he tries to love the reader. And I love that because it really puts the pressure off us and more so moves us toward the heart of God for the person who's going to pick up the book. And so I think my writing process was very similar to Elizabeth's, where I would just brain dump ideas. So let's say I was writing a liturgy for a lunch break. That's one of the ones I wrote. I would just write down everything that I knew about food in scripture. So I would just like go to the index at the back. I would try to recall, I'm like daily bread. I know that's a thing.
That's a thing. Yeah.
Fish
and
and
then
loaves.
my own, I would reflect on my own lunches and be like, what do I need when I'm taking a lunch break? And then I also would try to read other writings about the topic at hand. So a lot of poetry. There's not very much poetry about lunch. There is Frank O'Hara's lunch poem, but
tragedy.
What was it? Chesterton said the poets are mysteriously silent on the subject of cheese. I think
a gap in the literary canon. Clearly, we need more writing about lunch.
We must remedy this. So sometimes it was easier. Some topics were easier than others to research. But that really filled me. It felt communal to see what other writers that I admire have said about a topic before. And it helped to like add that human aspect to the prayer so that it's not like every single line was me just quoting a verse, We very much wanted the liturgies to be rooted in scripture first and foremost. But we can't just copy and paste the NIV. So unfortunately, that would just be fun. That was that.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about your liturgy for creativity. I want to start. I don't know how many liturgies we can talk about with our allotted time, but I definitely want to talk about that one.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have it.
I have mine.
Okay. So there, toward the end of this liturgy, you say, "We do not create, O God, to bring glory to ourselves. Rather, when we create, we are overshadowed by the wonder of your glory. Let us never worship our art, but let us be enraptured by you. May whatever we create echo your nature and radiate your goodness." I like that idea of being overshadowed. One way to protect our own work from glory seeking is to be overshadowed by the glory of God.
Absolutely.
And I especially, like that in light of the idea that the word for glory was something like heaviness, weight, You think about the glory of God is not just being something that can shadow, but something that's also heavy.
Yeah.
I just love to hear y'all talk some about that, the ideas that you play with in that liturgy for creativity.
Yeah. It's interesting that you said like, oh, go ahead, Audrey.
I just wanted to give Elizabeth credit. She wrote this one. So
all right.
Oh, I wasn't even thinking about that. Yeah. So Audrey's like, yeah, you can talk about this.
I thought no, but you should totally.
I just think, Jonathan, it's interesting how you talk about like, glory being weight. And I just think of like another thing that is weighty is like an anchor, and how like the Lord's glory, it overshadows us with this kind of this pleasant, I guess like a weighted blanket feel. Like we're like pleasantly weighted down with his significance. Because I feel like our significance, or like kind of the I don't know, the like deceiving bit about our significance is that of course we're very significant beings, but when we like place that as like the end all be all significance, like the thing that we need to like place above all else, it's not pleasant. It is not the pleasant weighting down of like what it's actually quite stressful, and it's like very difficult to maintain, impossible to maintain our own significance. And so being able to surrender ourselves to the significance of like God is so freeing. I think for me, like as a creative, like it frees me up to be creative and to not be trying to prove anything, to not like my significance is not on the line. It's like my creativity is something that is just like a response and a reflection of like a greater glory that is, it's fixed, it's there, it's dependable, it's anchoring me. And so because I'm anchored, I'm free to kind of like move out, dance, create. Like I'm not proving anything. So
I love that. The best part about writing a book of prayers is that the natural result should be that we're overshadowed by God, and that the significance has nothing to do with us as creators and how well we do it, but rather is one person able to connect with the living God through a prayer that is in this book. Awesome. Then be overshadowed so that's what's important.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And the more you look to increase your own significance through creative work, the more doomed you are to failure.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Absolutely.
Nothing true has been said.
If you're not working out of your significance, instead, if you're trying to work into significance, you're in trouble. And
absolutely.
That's so true.
Yeah.
It's just a dead end. It's a path to nowhere. And and I think, just going off what Audrey said, like our hope for these liturgies is that they're definitely like not our words, like these would be like words that other people can take and use for themselves, become their words, and then be like the starting point for them to truly like develop their own words for prayer.
And there's an optional ending for writers for this, which I appreciated.
Yes.
And I'd love to talk about some of these ideas with our remaining time. May we trust you. Isn't this rude of me to read you? I should let you all read it, but I want to read it.
No, please read
your own
it.
Podcast.
We love hearing
it. May we trust you with the words that come, not prematurely judging them as insufficient, but believing they have beauty, purpose, and beauty. Wow, I love that reminder not to prematurely judge. Not to prematurely judge our first drafts. Of course, first drafts are bad.
Of course they are.
Of course they are.
I even like when we were talking earlier, Jonathan, about like our liturgies for writing, I almost mentioned that like part of my creative liturgy was writing the rough draft and not judging it prematurely. Like actually like trusting myself and trusting the Lord enough to just get out a first draft and trust it and let it be. And I feel like that's a discipline that's hard to do. So not prematurely judging it as insignificant.
Yeah, it's an act of faith. Writing bad first drafts is an act of faith, and not stopping.
I need that tattooed on my forearm.
Absolutely, act of faith and not stopping. I think we need that, because halfway through a rough draft, we can be like, "This is terrible," and like, "I'm giving it all up," like, "Wow." But like that pushing through and just being like, "You know what? I'm going to keep going. I'm going to finish the draft." And like most of the time, I look back and I'm like, "Okay, I can work with this." Like. This is something really, we just need to like throw the clay on the wheel. That's all that needs to happen. Like we're starting from nothing. We just need some source material to work with.
Yeah. And that voice that says this is terrible may not be wrong. It may be terrible at this moment. And, but that I often talk about the need, not to silence your inner critic, but to make friends and to say, hey, thank you, inner critic, for being willing to help, but you need to be quiet here, but we'll get back to you.
Absolutely.
So thank you. Appreciate your service. But at the moment, I need you to maybe go find something else to do.
Yeah.
That is
Jonathan, you're speaking to my soul.
Yes.
Such good writer advice.
Speaking
and just life advice. Like we're going to have a critic, an inner voice for everything in life. Like not even just our creativity, but relationships, faith, just living, work, vocation. So learning to talk to it. And that's really good food for thought.
And and at the same time, befriending the inner critic, and also knowing the difference between what is actually my inner critic and what is something I've internalized from somebody else that's not really my opinion or my taste or my whatever. And I think that's even harder than befriending the inner critic, is knowing, what's the inner critic and what is an external voice.
Yeah.
Now that I think about it, I just had this conversation with your fellow New Yorker, Melanie Penn. And so, but it will have been over a month since that episode aired, so we'll be fine for me to repeat myself.
Okay. Oh yeah, I just listened to that episode.
Please do. Me too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're about to run out of time, but I want to have time for my last. So there's two of you. I need extra time for my last question.
Okay.
And that is, who are the writers who make you want to write?
Oh, such a good question.
I know. Wow.
I'm happy to start with either one of you, or we can draw straws, whatever we need to do here.
Go for it, Elizabeth.
Wow. Okay. I was going to volunteer you, but okay, you can do it.
You got this.
I will quickly throw out two poets and a musician, and that's all. The poets are Mary Oliver and David White. Those are two poets that I read on a regular basis. I have multiple of their poems memorized just because I've read them so many times. But they are both people that bring out, I think, they make poems, prayers, without you realizing they're prayers. Like, I feel like anyone can pray while reading their poetry, even if they don't consider themselves religious, or even if they're like, I've never really prayed before, but all of a sudden I feel like I'm connecting with a higher power. That's how I feel. So I think that they make like spirituality or just like, connecting with.
Is David White from the Pacific Northwest? Is he?
He is Irish, and I don't know. Yeah. He was a contemporary of John O'Donohue.
Gotcha.
Has passed, but David White is amazing. His collection, The Bell, he has several collections, but The Bell and the Blackbird, I think, might be his most recent. Also wrote The House of Belonging. Amazing. And then this is just a random fun thing, but I think that Maggie Rogers inspires me to write.
Yes.
Just because I just still remember watching the YouTube video of like when Pharrell discovered her. And I was so inspired by her just like being herself, and him being so captivated by her just like literally being herself. I went out and wrote like the best poem I've ever written right after watching that YouTube video. I was like, oh my gosh, we just have to be ourselves. We just have to write from our heart.
Yes.
And then I was
a revelation.
I was so inspired. So that was a very inspirational moment for me.
That's great. Yeah. Audrey, how about you? Who are the writers that make you want to write?
Wow. I mean, I could echo all of those, like all three.
Well, you can't, because you got to give a new answer.
Yes.
I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Totally understandable. I would say fiction writers stir me up the most, particularly writers of fiction that's like fiction that's very quiet and less centered on plot and more centered on characterization. Like I am more excited about a description of a like boiling pot, just like a chapter describing a pot, than I would be like a murder mystery. So some writers that come to mind are Marilynne Robinson, of course. Alice McDermott. I read 2 of her novels this year, and I am a devoted fan now. Kazuo Ishiguro, Never Let Me Go, is just one of my all-time faves. And Claire in the Sun, which is newer. From him, Jhumpa Lahiri, her short collection, Interpreter of Maladies, is so quiet and so nuanced, and like I just look up to her so much. Toni Morrison, I mean, Wayne. Flannery O'Connor,
oh my God.
I just, like
the patron saints.
Mean, in different ways, all of those fiction writers, just I feel like I just have like their like quotes from their work just written down all over my room and in this journal I keep of quotes. And if you were to read it, it would look so uninspiring, but it's like in the context of their work, their writing is just so good and every sentence is perfect. You can tell each word, they care about each word that they use. And then Wendell Berry. I mean, Wendell Berry, his fiction, which I feel like gets less attention than his poetry and his nonfiction. It's so quiet, like nothing really happens, but it's beautiful. And that's
love him for that.
Yeah.
We love him for writing
We
quiet
love him
fiction.
For that.
Yeah, I know. I love that list. That's a lot of my people would, were on that list too. So
amazing.
All right, y'all. Well, thank you so much for these liturgies. They do a lot of people a lot of good. And thank you for being on the Habit Podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. Such a joy.
Such a joy. Really appreciate it.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.